The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Avenue as Mai pulled into the hospital parking lot, exhausted but satisfied after another volunteer shift in the pediatric ward. The 17-year-old had spent hours reading to sick children, her gentle voice bringing smiles to tired faces. She checked her watch, just enough time to make it home for family dinner. As she carefully navigated her mom's old Honda Civic through the quiet suburban streets, Mike couldn't help but smile thinking about little Tommy, who had finally laughed today after weeks of treatment. Lost in thought, she almost missed the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. She was certain she hadn't been speeding. The car's speedometer was one of the few things that still worked perfectly. Following procedure just like her parents had taught her, Mai signaled and pulled over to the curb, hands visible on the steering wheel. Officer Richard stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his sunglasses despite the fading daylight. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, each step deliberate and threatening. Something about his posture made May's skin crawl. License and registration, he barked before even reaching her window. His voice carried none of the professional courtesy she expected. May's trembling fingers retrieved the documents from her wallet. "Here you are, sir," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. The officer snatched the license from her hand, studying it with exaggerated suspicion. "Where'd you get this?" he demanded, tapping the license against his flashlight. "These fakes are getting better and better." "Sir, that's my real license. I got it at the DMV 6 months ago," Maya explained, her confusion giving way to a creeping sense of dread. "Yeah, right. You people are always trying to pull something," Officer Richard sneered, making no attempt to hide his contempt. "Step out of the vehicle." Mrs. Lee, the owner of the corner grocery store, was restocking her outdoor fruit display when she noticed the scene unfolding. Something about the officer's aggressive stance and the young girl's obvious fear made her pause. Quietly, she pulled out her phone and began recording. "I said get out." Officer Richard's voice rose sharply when Mai hesitated, her seat belt temporarily stuck. The young girl's hands shook as she finally managed to free herself, stepping out into the cool evening air. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back, remembering her mother's words about staying strong in the face of injustice. What started as a routine drive home was quickly spiraling into a nightmare, and neither me nor Officer Richard realized that the next few minutes would spark a chain of events that would shake their small community to its core. Mrs. Lee's finger hovered over her phone's screen, documenting every second of the unfolding incident, while in a nearby hospital office, a name on an incident report would soon catch the attention of someone with the power to change everything. The evening air grew colder as Officer Richard circled Mee's car like a predator stalking its prey. His flashlight beam swept across the vehicle's interior, casting harsh shadows that made everything look suspicious in his eyes. Mai stood shivering by the roadside, her hospital volunteer badge still hanging around her neck. "What's this? Some kind of fake ID, too," he sneered, pointing at her volunteer badge. "You think wearing this makes you look more legit?" "It's my hospital badge, sir. I volunteer in the children's ward," May explained, her voice barely above a whisper. The pride she usually felt mentioning her volunteer work had vanished, replaced by a gnawing fear. "Sure you do," Officer Richard scoffed. He yanked open the car's back door without warning, rummaging through her backpack. Her carefully organized schoolbooks and notes scattered across the seat. "Probably stealing medicine, aren't you? That's what you people do, right?" From her storefront, Mrs. Lee's hands trembled as she continued recording. She'd seen discrimination before, but this was different. This was abuse of power happening right before her eyes. Her phone captured every degrading comment, every violation of protocol. "Sir, please. May try it again. I have my volunteer coordinator's number. You can call and verify." "Shut up." Officer Richard spun around, his face contorted with anger. I'm conducting a search here. Or maybe you'd like to spend the night in jail instead." Tears finally spilled down Mi's cheeks, but she stood her ground. Her parents hadn't raised her to break under pressure. Still, each passing minute felt like an eternity as the officer tore through her belongings, making snide comments about everything he found. He pulled out her lunch container, still containing the leftovers of her mother's homemade dumplings. "What's this? Probably hiding drugs in here." He popped the lid open, deliberately spilling the contents onto the pavement. A small crowd had begun to gather at a safe distance. Some pulled out their phones, joining Mrs. Lee in documenting the incident. Officer Richard either didn't notice or didn't care, too caught up in his power trip to realize he was creating his own downfall. "Nothing here," he finally announced, sounding almost disappointed. "But I'm writing you up for suspicious behavior and possible fake identification." He began scribbling on his ticket pad, his handwriting as aggressive as his attitude. Mi's mind raced to her parents, to the stories they'd told her about standing up for herself while staying safe. She memorized his badge number, knowing it would be important later. The crushing weight of injustice pressed down on her shoulders, but underneath the fear, a spark of determination began to grow. Little did Officer Richard know that less than a mile away, in the same hospital where Mai volunteered, someone who would change the course of this story was about to end their shift. Someone whose position of authority would finally put a stop to his long history of abuse. Mrs. Lee's fingers were starting to cramp from holding her phone steady, but she didn't dare stop recording. Through her shop window, she could see her regular customers gathering, their faces a mix of concern and outrage. The evening light was fading, but her phone's camera captured everything with crystal clarity. Every harsh word, every intimidating gesture. "I've got enough footage," whispered Mr. Chen, the retired teacher who lived above her shop. He had his phone out too, quietly documenting from a different angle. "This isn't right. That girl could be any of our children." The officer's voice carried clearly across the street as he continued berating Mai, unaware that his every move was being preserved as evidence. Mrs. Lee zoomed in just enough to capture his badge number clearly, 4472. Her hands might have been shaking, but years of careful shop bookkeeping had taught her the importance of documenting details. A young man in medical scrubs stopped at the shop door, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on?" He whispered to Mrs. Lee. She quickly filled him in, her voice trembling with controlled anger. "That's one of our volunteers," he said, recognition dawning on his face. "She reads to the kids in my ward. This is completely wrong." He pulled out his own phone, adding another angle to the growing collection of evidence. Across the street, Officer Richard was so caught up in his power trip that he failed to notice the growing number of witnesses. Each degrading comment, each violation of proper police procedure, each abuse of power was being captured from multiple angles. His career was unraveling with every word, but his blind prejudice kept him from seeing it. Mrs. Lee's mind raced ahead, already planning her next steps. She had the cell number for a local community organizer saved in her phone. Her nephew worked at the local news station. Her sister-in-law volunteered at the same hospital where Mai helped out. The network of support was already forming, invisible but strong. A police cruiser rolled past slowly, another officer on patrol. Mrs. Lee held her breath, hoping they might stop and intervene. But the car continued on, and her heart sank. Later, this too would become part of the story, the silent complicity that allowed such behavior to continue. "Got his partner's car number too," Mr. Chen murmured, his teacher's habit of taking thorough notes serving a new purpose. Every detail matters. The growing collection of video evidence would soon become the cornerstone of justice, but right now, all these witnesses could do was document silently, their hearts breaking for the young girl who stood alone against such blatant abuse of power. They didn't know yet that their careful documentation would soon reach someone who could finally put a stop to years of unchecked discrimination. The police station lobby felt cold and unwelcoming as Mai sat with her parents, waiting to file their complaint. Her mother held her hand tightly, while her father kept checking his phone, reviewing the videos that Mrs. Lee and other witnesses had shared with them. Number 23 called the desk sergeant, his voice emotionless. Mi's family rose together, approaching the high counter where a different officer sat typing at an ancient computer. The nameplate read, Officer Wilson. We're here to file a complaint about Officer Richard, badge number 4472. Mi's father stated firmly, his voice steady despite his anger. He harassed my daughter during a traffic stop yesterday evening. Officer Wilson barely looked up from his screen. Complaint forms are over there. He gestured vaguely toward a dusty shelf. Fill them out and submit them. We'll look into it. We have video evidence, Mi's mother added, pulling out her phone. Multiple witnesses recorded the entire incident. This finally got Wilson's attention, though not in the way they'd hoped. His expression hardened. Ma'am, recording police officers during their duties can be a serious offense. Actually, came a new voice from behind them. Citizens have every right to record police officers performing their duties in public spaces. A middle-aged man in a suit stepped forward, placing his business card on the counter. I'm with the Civil Rights Legal Center. The family called us this morning. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted instantly. Officer Wilson's dismissive attitude gave way to careful professionalism. He pulled out a fresh complaint form himself, suddenly eager to take detailed notes. We have 8 different video recordings of the incident, the lawyer continued, plus witness statements from 12 bystanders, including 3 hospital staff members who can verify Ms. Chen's volunteer status. As they filed the official complaint, Mai noticed other officers peeking out from behind doors and desks, whispering among themselves. She could feel their stares, some hostile, others uncertain. One young officer looked genuinely troubled by the situation. Make sure this complaint gets properly logged, the lawyer emphasized, taking photos of each completed form. We'll be following up daily on its progress. Walking out of the station an hour later, Mai felt drained, but somehow stronger. The weight of injustice still pressed down on her shoulders, but now she wasn't carrying it alone. What she didn't know was that her complaint was about to land on a very particular desk, setting in motion events that would shake the department to its core. The hospital's ethics committee meeting was running late, and Dr. Patricia sat at the head of the conference table, reviewing incident reports. As chief of ethics, these meetings were usually routine, until she saw the name Mai on a newly filed complaint. Her eyes widened as she read further, recognizing the officer's name and badge number. Her hands began to shake slightly as she remembered her son's angry rant at dinner just yesterday. These people coming here, thinking they own the place, he had spat between bites. She tried to challenge his views countless times before, but he'd grown more defensive, more entrenched in his prejudices. Dr. Patricia, her assistant's voice broke through her thoughts. The pediatric ward sent these volunteer records you requested. The files confirmed everything. Mai had been a dedicated volunteer for over 2 years, spending countless hours reading to sick children, helping with art therapy, bringing comfort to families during their darkest moments. The contrast between these glowing reports and her son's treatment of the girl made Dr. Patricia's stomach turn. She picked up her office phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. Making this call would change everything. Her relationship with her son, possibly his entire career. But the image of a young volunteer being harassed for nothing more than her appearance steeled her resolve. Internal Affairs, Detective Wong speaking, came the answer after 3 rings. Detective, this is Dr. Patricia from Memorial Hospital. I need to report a serious incident of police misconduct. The officer involved. She paused, taking a deep breath, is my son. The silence on the other end stretched for a moment. Ma'am, are you sure you want to do this? What I want, she replied, her voice growing stronger, is to do what's right. I have evidence of a pattern of behavior that cannot continue. As she hung up the phone, Dr. Patricia pulled out her personal diary. For years, she documented her son's concerning comments, his growing prejudices, her failed attempts to guide him back to the values she tried to instill. She had never imagined these private notes would become evidence, but now they would help ensure justice was served. The setting sun cast long shadows through her office window as she began gathering her records. Sometimes doing the right thing meant facing painful truths, even when they hit closest to home. The Internal Affairs Office buzzed with unusual energy. Detective Wong spread the evidence across her desk. Multiple video recordings from different angles, witness statements, Mi's volunteer records, and most surprisingly, Dr. Patricia's detailed personal diary documenting her son's concerning behavior. "This is unprecedented," Detective Wong muttered to her partner. A mother turning in her own son. But these records, she gestured at the growing pile of evidence. Years of documented racist comments, complaints that were buried, witnesses who were intimidated into silence. The investigation moved quickly. Other officers, seeing the direction of the wind, began coming forward. A young rookie described how Officer Richard had pressured him to falsify reports. A dispatcher shared recordings of inappropriate comments made over the radio. The wall of silence was cracking. "Look at this," Detective Wong's partner called from his computer. 3 previous complaints filed against Officer Richard in the last year alone. All involving minority drivers, all mysteriously dropped. Dr. Patricia sat in the interview room, her posture straight despite her obvious emotional exhaustion. "I should have done this sooner," she admitted, her voice steady. "I kept hoping he would change, that my influence as his mother would be enough. But watching that video of him harassing an innocent volunteer from my own hospital, I couldn't stay silent anymore." The investigation team worked through the night, piecing together a pattern that stretched back years. Each new piece of evidence revealed a deeper story of unchecked prejudice and abuse of power. Officer Richard's personnel file grew thick with documented incidents, each one painting a clearer picture of systemic issues that had been ignored for too long. As dawn broke, Detective Wong made the call that would start the formal disciplinary process. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning. But it was Dr. Patricia's courage in coming forward that had finally broken through years of institutional protection. "We're ready," Detective Wong announced to her team. "This ends now." In her office at the hospital, Dr. Patricia looked at an old family photo on her desk. Sometimes love meant making the hardest choices, she thought, quietly turning the frame face down. The evidence room in Internal Affairs felt smaller than usual as Detective Wong and her team laid out their findings. Photos, video screenshots, and documents covered every surface. Mrs. Lee's clear footage played on a screen, showing Officer Richard's abuse of power in high definition. Next to it, time-stamped dash cam footage from other incidents told a similar story. 6 minority drivers stopped in 1 week, Detective Wong pointed to a chart. 0 white drivers. All stops lasted over 30 minutes. None resulted in actual citations. She moved to another board covered in witness statements. Pattern shows escalating behavior over the past 3 years. Detective Chen, the youngest on the team, held up Dr. Patricia's diary. His own mother documented everything. Listen to this entry from 2 years ago. Today at dinner, he said they should all go back where they came from. My heart broke. Where did I go wrong? The investigation had uncovered more than just one officer's misconduct. A network of silent enablers emerged. Officers who looked the other way, supervisors who buried complaints, a system that protected its own at the expense of justice. "Look at these deleted emails," another investigator called out. Someone tried to bury May's complaint too, but the system backup caught it. The team gathered around his computer, watching as he recovered message after message showing attempted cover-ups. The evidence was damning. Mrs. Lee's video had started an avalanche that couldn't be stopped. Other victims began coming forward, sharing similar stories of harassment and discrimination. Each new testimony added another brick to the wall of evidence. His dash cam was mysteriously turned off during several stops, Detective Wong noted, adding another sheet to the pile. But he forgot about the backup audio system. We have everything. As the team prepared their final report, the weight of their findings hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about breaking a cycle of institutional protection that had allowed such behavior to flourish. The police department's hearing room was packed to capacity. Officer Richard sat alone at one table, his usual arrogance replaced by nervous fidgeting. At the other table, Internal Affairs presented their mountain of evidence. The police chief and review board members listened intently, their faces growing grimmer with each revelation. And now, Detective Wong announced, "We call Dr. Patricia Richard to testify." The room fell silent as Dr. Patricia walked in, her hospital ID still hanging around her neck after her morning rounds. Officer Richard's face drained of color as his mother took the witness stand. Their eyes met briefly, hers filled with determination, his with betrayal. "Dr. Patricia," Detective Wong began, "please tell the board about your observations of your son's behavior over the past 3 years." Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. "I watched my son change from a caring person into someone I barely recognized. I documented everything, hoping I could help him change." She pulled out her diary. These entries show a pattern of growing prejudice and anger. Officer Richard slumped in his chair as his mother read entry after entry. Stories of family dinners ruined by hateful comments. Incidents where he bragged about targeting minority drivers. His growing collection of complaints that mysteriously disappeared. "As his mother, this breaks my heart," Dr. Patricia concluded, wiping away tears. "But as someone responsible for hospital ethics, I couldn't stay silent when I saw him harassing one of our most dedicated volunteers." The evidence was overwhelming. Mrs. Lee's video played on the screen, followed by other incidents captured on camera. Each piece of evidence drove another nail into Officer Richard's career coffin. The police chief stood up, his decision already clear. "Officer Richard, turn in your badge and gun. Your employment with this department is terminated, effective immediately. Furthermore, we'll be reviewing every arrest you've made in the past 3 years." As Officer Richard stormed out, Dr. Patricia remained seated, her shoulders straight despite the weight of what she'd done. Sometimes justice required painful sacrifices, but she knew she'd made the right choice. 3 months after the hearing, the hospital's community room was filled with hope and purpose. Mai stood at a podium, addressing a diverse crowd of police officers, community members, and hospital staff. Behind her, a banner read, "Community Unity Task Force." "What happened to me was wrong," she spoke clearly into the microphone. "But from that wrong, we're building something right." She gestured to Dr. Patricia, who sat in the front row. "Together, we're creating change." The task force, born from their shared experience, had already made significant improvements. New bias training programs were mandatory for all officers. A civilian review board now included community members from all backgrounds. Body cameras couldn't be turned off during stops anymore. Mrs. Lee, now a key member of the Oversight Committee, smiled proudly from her seat. Her small act of courage, recording that video, had sparked a movement. Her shop had become an unofficial community center, where people shared stories and supported each other. Dr. Patricia approached the podium next. The past months hadn't been easy. Her son still wouldn't speak to her, but she stood tall. "Sometimes doing what's right means facing our own painful truths," she said. "But every positive change starts with one person willing to stand up." The audience included several young police academy recruits, listening intently as speakers shared experiences and insights. The department's new training program now included regular community engagement sessions and cultural awareness workshops. Mi's volunteer work had expanded too. She now led a youth program helping kids understand their rights and responsibilities during police interactions. Her quiet strength had transformed into leadership that inspired others. As the meeting ended, people lingered to chat, sharing stories and plans for future initiatives. What had started as one terrible incident had grown into a movement for lasting change. In the back of the room, someone had posted a simple sign: "Change starts with us." The evening sun streamed through the windows as me and Dr. Patricia walk out together, their unlikely friendship a symbol of healing and hope for the entire community.